Thank you all for coming out. I am Daniel Myers from South Carolina, coming from the U.S. Today we'll be looking at six mallet technique and some fundamentals to get people started in kind of breaking down some barriers that might be causing them some resistance into the genre. So before we jump into this, I'll just demonstrate the technique a little bit with an excerpt from Itsuki Fantasy by Keiko Abe. So that's just a brief excerpt of Itsuki Fantasy, and there's two reasons why I wanted to share that today. Is that in the history of the genre of six mallet literature, that is the first published piece for six mallets. So just a landmark representation of what the grip can do, what it is capable of, as well as everything I'm going to talk about today and introduce is something that you guys can take home and be able to play this piece as well, because it uses relatively rudimentary skills within the grip. So just a little bit about how I got started into this. A couple years ago, there's a wonderful vibraphone piece called Meditation by Takayoshi Yoshioka. And the very beginning of it, this is the opening line, utilizes some six mallet technique. And this got me introduced to trying to hold the mallets and hold the grip. But as we can see, some of the chords look pretty wild with all their enharmonics going on, but really the mallets don't ever move positions. Everything's in a pretty neutral triad position, but gets pretty creative compositionally. But this introduced me into the grip. And after that, I really wanted to see what was possible. And then most of my experience is actually in vibraphone literature with six mallets, which I'll present a piece later on. But this is what really got me started. And so today, we'll look at just a few things. What is the mallet orientation? There are a number of types of grips. We'll look at the grip that I use and the fundamentals on how to utilize that. And then some basic expansions and contractions. So how do we change our intervals? I think these are some of the biggest things that might be seen as roadblocks with this grip. And then we'll diagnose a couple common problems with this. So the mallet orientation, at least in the US, we number left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4. We just continue that process with 6, adding on 5 and 6. And so mallets 1, 2, and 3 are in the left hand, 4, 5, and 6 in the right hand. I heavily suggest using some sort of a graduated set, especially on marimba, as we're utilizing just a much greater range. And depending on the chords that we're trying to play, it can get very dense, especially some of the overtones found on the marimba. So trying to give each mallet a little bit more of a characteristic so that we can actually hear what is going on. So there are a number of different solutions here. This is a setup that I just played with where the bass and soprano voices are highlighted. Go through a couple cool colors here. So if you have a lot of bass stuff where the extra mallet is accenting that, or the same with the soprano, you can emphasize that as well. Maybe you want to have the middle mallets have a completely different texture, and if you are really want to go after it, you can have 6 individual mallets, but that isn't really necessary. But really trying to go for some sort of graduated set so that you hear really each individual note as best as we can. So moving forward, just so that we're all on the same page about what I'll be talking about, is that our outside mallets, color coordinated. When I say outside, it'll always be the furthest away from us, so mallets 1 and 6. The middle will be the middle of each hand, so mallets 2 and 5, and then the inside, the innermost, will be mallets 3 and 4. So there are a number of grips. So if we come from a Musser-Stevens background, this has been pioneered by Dean Gronemeyer and Kai Stensgaard. I know this grip more familiar with Kai Stensgaard, and this is more or less just adding on an extra note within our middle mallet. We just kind of slap it in the middle. And so we have a bit of a Burton approach in there, and then our outside mallet is relatively still in Stevens. This might seem like a good way to go, especially for Stevens players. That did not personally work for me. So the pro is just, if we're familiar with the grip, we just have a slight adaptation. But there are quite a few limitations, especially in the mobility of the inner note. And I'll come back to that when we start looking at the pros of the Burton grip. Now, a traditional based grip is just not really viable because of the shape of our hand. So if we're stacking where the innermost mallet is closest to our palm, we're just not really able to arrive at an even plane with the mallet. So at least in my personal experience, I've tried a couple times because that was the first cross grip that I experimented with. It's just not viable to me. So we arrive at Burton, and this seems to have the most versatility in the grip for a number of reasons. It fits the hand in a much natural way that traditional does not. But the biggest pros comes with the mobility, that I have a lot more individual capability of each mallet. And then the inner mallet, any mallet can actually change length, which I'll introduce a couple circumstances where that might be necessary. So that is really the big pro compared to a Stevens approach where the base of the mallets are locked into your palm. You're stuck with however you start with this grip. All right, so going over the Burton approached grip, we're actually mixing several different techniques to arrive at this. So there's several elements coming from work done by Ed Sandin with his fulcrum grip, Ne Rossaro's extended technique, Joe Porter, who's actually a previous WPG alum. And so we're mixing kind of all of these elements to make a soup of technique that is as versatile as possible. So coming from the Burton side is really just the order of the mallets, that the outermost mallet is closest to our palm, and then we add one more underneath that, and we just kind of continue that process. All right, several of the texts, Joe Porter has a text for this, which is a great resource, but they get caught up in so much of this is how you need to hold this stick and this stick. I think of it more as kind of an extended Burton grip is the easiest way to arrive at how to hold these sticks. Then we're also mixing some elements of a traditional grip in the way that we utilize our back fulcrum. So the difference that a Burton grip that we have a little bit more of a right angle and our thumb can typically be on top, at least in my experience. We're a little bit more refined in the back of the fulcrum. I'll go over that in a little bit more detail, but so we have some of that element of the traditional grip, but the stacking, the order of the mallets is coming from a Burton background. So I'll show some pictures as we go through this, actually from Joe's text, since I did not take my own pictures. So now that we're thinking of the Burton order, that the innermost is the furthest away from our palm, we can look at several checkpoints on how to grip each mallet with fingers in a slightly different way. So our pinky is actually completely supporting just our inner two mallets. Right, from there, our ring finger is reaching around and supporting the inner mallet, and that's very akin to a normal Burritt grip, where our ring finger reaches over and supports the base of that mallet. And then our middle finger is just adding support to the inner mallet. So gravity kind of takes control there. So before I get a little too ahead of myself, I'll swipe over, if it will let me. We can see a rough picture of how this is supposed to be if you can't see my hands from all the way up here. So we see that the pinky is completely supporting what would be the innermost mallets. The ring finger is reaching all the way over and supporting the base of that mallet. And then uniquely where Ed Sandin's grip comes in, the fulcrum grip, is how we approach the middle mallet. And this is what gives us a lot of versatility with this grip, is that especially in a neutral position, we approach this more like a snare drum stick, or like we're just holding a general two mallet approach. All right, so we have our thumb and our first finger supporting that mallet as best as we can. And when we get to doing some interval changes, that is pretty paramount to why this exists. So we have a network of fingers that all utilize this differently, but is able to allow us to manipulate each mallet in a different way. So hand position, this is a common question that I get, is, well, how far should the mallets be in my hand? There might be a number of instances why you might need more stick in the back of your hand. I typically start with the majority of the base of my mallet secured in the base of my hand as a good starting point. But if you're if you're working with music that might need to do something a little bit different, use it to your advantage. You can manipulate anything any way that you want. So it's really dependent on the music. There's a Graham Fitkin piece for marimba and saxophone that pretty much requires the player to be like this for the duration of the piece. So the versatility of this is really, really great. So with this basic kind of fundamental start that we have going with the grip, where we would start is a triple vertical stroke. So this is just going to be any simultaneous attack of all three mallets. It can be in any position, any order, and this is no different than us doing double vertical strokes, things that we practice all the time, even if it's just one mallet in each hand. The approach is going to be all the same, executed with the wrist and any arm if necessary. So the first exercise that I would suggest getting started is starting in a neutral position with just some basic triads. And then we can go up diatonically. This is a very great place to get a sense of how we need to hold the mallets in our hands, build that kind of muscle memory of all the pressure points in our hand. So starting place with the right hand would just be on C major. And there's the same in the left hand. There we go. And if you're brave, at the same time. So getting used to just this slight graduation with a very easy neutral position in our hand is a great way to start. And then we're already ready for the next lesson, which is starting to get a little bit more involved with our expansions and contractions. Because we can't really move on until we know how to make subtle changes in our grip. So it's actually pretty simple. Most people, this is probably their first big roadblock. It's like, well, how do I change intervals? I feel like I just get locked into one sort of grip. So we'll go through each mallet and see how it changes. So all movement is going to come from a combination of your thumb, first, middle, and ring fingers. Your pinky is never going to do anything except for support those mallets at the back of our hand. All right, that is not in the equation in terms of changing our interval sizes. So for the middle mallet, this is going to be primarily with our thumb and first finger. All right, it's very archaic. We can just push it one way or the other. All right, we don't need to overthink it. So if I want to go to the left with my right hand, I can just push over with my finger, with my first finger that way. If I want to go that way, I can do the same thing. All right, not anything overly complicated. Now, we do arrive to an issue where the smaller that the interval is to either mallet, we need to put our fingers over it to arrive to some stability. So this is no different than a traditional grip or a cross grip that when we're reaching wide intervals, we do the same thing. So if I approach something close to a second here, my finger actually reaches over. And if I approach a second on the other side, it just helps support that all the way over there. So a basic exercise, exercise 2, introducing some very subtle change coming from our neutral position, this triad, is just pushing the inner mallet one way or the other. So we're isolating that inner mallet, so I'm able to push it down to D. And then we can change the level of our exterior notes once we get used to how that feels. So if I want to expand that, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But this is a very simple way to isolate what our inner mallet is doing. Our middle mallet. Now, the inside mallet, this is a little bit more interesting because it's manipulated with our middle finger and our ring finger. And all of this is dependent on the size of our hands and depending on how wide we want to go. So our middle finger is the one that really supports that innermost mallet, and I'm able to just kind of push it out there. If I want really wide intervals, I can continue to do that with my ring finger. So just pushing around with our thumb and first finger with the innermost, and then really the same thing with the next two fingers. The outside mallet does not move. All right, nothing special there. We don't have to worry about that, and that's no different than any other grip where our intervals, all the changes is kind of derived from the innermost mallet moving. It's the same thing, we just have an extra mallet in our hand. So don't need to worry about that. So now that we can arrive to some conclusion on how to change this interval, our outside mallets, by pushing out with our ring finger or middle finger, we can get to that octave, and then we arrive at this pretty gnarly exercise here, which takes the moving the inner mallet to another level. So if we've expanded our outside notes, and then now we can see the starting position. We've arrived at where I need to support that mallet on top with some downward pressure. And so we would just move the inner mallet up the scale. Oh, it is hard. So that is kind of an extreme exercise to practice your mobility while keeping the exterior notes relatively stationary. Then from there, since we have some sort of understanding on basic manipulation, we can do several different things. We can go all the way back to our first exercise where we're just doing parallel chords. We started there, so now we know how to change our inversion. So we can go to our first inversion and do the same thing with just parallel motion. Our second inversion. And these are just basic technique things that I'm sure we can all be much more creative than this. But with just this basic understanding on how to make those manipulations, we can start to actually start playing some music. So the next level of that would be doing all your inversions on one key. So if we run through all the inversions of C, we're constantly having to make subtle changes as we go up the keyboard. So we have root, first, second. Whoop. Let me try it with my right hand, a little bit better. There we go. So a little bit more advanced, but we're shortening the distance of like the time we have to think about those subtle changes in our hand. So that is roughly all the information on triple verticals. Here's just a number of any exercises that you could do to just force yourself into new situations, not thinking harmonically, but thinking more about what we're doing with intervals, pushing the mallets around. So the first example would be pushing the inner and the outer mallet each out a note. And you can come up with any number of these. Again, I'm sure you guys are much more creative than I am with this. So the next big thing would be, how do we do independent strokes with so many mallets in our hands? This is the more kind of sciencey part of this, is talking about the axis of rotation. With two mallets in our hands, when we arrive to some sort of independent stroke, that's always rotating around the other mallet. So when we have smaller intervals, that rotation of axis of rotation is much tighter. It's a very similar thing. We just have one extra kind of concept to add on to with the extra mallet. With doing single independent strokes, the axis of rotation is generally going to be the innermost mallet. So if I'm at my neutral position, just a triad, really the point that I'm trying to rotate around is our inner mallet. And same with the outside. And so this note here about thinking about z-axis and y-axis is, z and x, is how close this inner mallet is to the mallet that I'm trying to rotate. So if I'm all the way out here, I need a little bit more forward motion in order to execute this mallet without the mallet touching or completely flailing around. So we just need to take an extra step and think about which axis are you utilizing. The smaller the interval, there's always just a little bit more forward motion to that. So why is this important? Well, a good exercise that we can start with is scales. This is one of the few times that we can actually get away from just our white notes and get a little bit more adventurous around the keyboard if we're tired of just playing in C major. That is one of the unfortunate realities of developing the technique. Is the easiest way is to live in the white notes. But scales, we all know them, they're our friends. We can practice these in unison, each hand, in each mallet, really. Starting out very simply, if we're new to the group, would be to just practice with our outer mallets, so either the inside or the outside. And the point that I'm not going to get to with this presentation would be the inner rotation. All right, so you can achieve that, but we're not going to dig into that. So great chance to practice your scales and get used to that rotation. So why is this important? We can look at some of the literature out there. So this is an excerpt of what I just performed from Itsuki Fantasy, where each hand is utilizing independent strokes. So the left hand is just using outside and inside. And because of the nature of the piece, the right hand is exclusively our outside mallet because of the melody. And so on. So already in the past, however long, 15, 20 minutes, we can arrive at a way to practice and learn a landmark piece in the repertoire. The piece does not use anything other than triple verticals and single independent strokes. We can also do double vertical strokes, and this is a really big part of the benefit of this technique because of the way that we can pull certain mallets out of the way. It can be in any combination. We can do 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, or 1 and 3. And the best part about this grip is to get the inner mallet out of the way, I can just pull up with my finger. So we actually arrive at being able to play just 4 mallet literature by getting this out of the way. Now the problem with doing double verticals, or something to consider, is whichever double vertical you're going to play, going back to that axis of rotation, is you actually need to think about the median point of these in order for them to arrive at the same time. So if I just think, if I want to play, if I just want to play F and A right here, and I only think about turning to the left as if I was doing an independent stroke, that's really what you're going to get. So your wrist, you actually need to kind of do a little bit of calculation and look at whatever that median point is for any of those double stops, any combination. That's just a slight calculation that we have to make. So basic exercises, any interval, you can do your thirds with any, oh, there we go. Any set of intervals, any combination, very, very basic. The next thing would be to come up with some sort of alternation of these where we're doing groups of 1 note and 2 notes. These are some excerpted exercises from Joe Porter's text, The 6 Mallet Technique Diversified. So we can do, or the other way. Again, this is just going to be any number of technical exercise to arrive at exploiting that. This is a very good technique to develop as it arrives a lot compositionally. An excerpt that we see that is just making general shapes on the keyboard to where we might have our outer notes a little bit closer together, and then utilizing the other mallet separately. So a brief excerpt from Komodo by Robert Patterson utilizes this, where we're just making kind of parallel shapes down the keyboard by maintaining this. It shows up a lot in literature. We can go the other way, which it does in a recap. So very, like this gets us through about 80% of the repertoire, and we don't have to have our inner mallet independence. It's the same way that there are hundreds of great marimba solos for four mallets that don't need triple laterals and one-handed rolls. We don't need to learn the most advanced technique to be able to play some of this literature. So looking at a couple common problems to see how we might need to be a little bit more innovative in our thinking is how do we play on both manuals? This is probably the biggest concern that people might have. One advantage with this grip is we could really kind of set ourselves up a little bit better if we really needed to, and we don't have to do a little bit of extra work. If I have the time to pull and manipulate the mallet, so I can even push this back and be able to play with one note on the lower manual if I really wanted to. And that will appear in my vibraphone piece that I'll demonstrate. There is a technique known as the manual pull that is coined by Dean Gronemeyer that utilizes increasing the angle this way so that the middle mallet arrives at the upper manual a little bit earlier. So you do have to pull this up a little bit. You do sacrifice some sound because we're playing more on the crown, but if you can find some sort of compromise by maybe increasing this length here so that we don't have to extend as far, but it is a possibility. So it is an inconvenience, but it is not impossible. Another way that we can play on both manuals would be being a little bit more creative by where we play on the edges. So if we take a look at back to Itsuki Fantasy, the left hand is required to play a chromatic run down with all three pitches moving in parallel motion. So how do we do that? Is we take advantage of the edge that is furthest away from the player, something that we probably don't ever have to run into. So I'm able to get that, how is it written? D flat minor chord by playing on the edge further away from us on the white notes. All right, pretty unique approach. And here's an example of some difficult chords that we might run into. So initially we see a C, D, and E flat in the right hand. And we might think that that's pretty impossible to play, right? We have a second on the lower manual and then one note on the top. But if we just change our thinking a little bit and we actually expand our intervals and we think much wider, I'm able to play all of them with a modified grip. We see a very closed chord, and we might think that our intervals need to be closed. But if we actually kind of reverse engineer that and we go a little bit wider, I'm able to play this excerpt from Komodo. And so on. And where are we? And then the general consensus is just to embrace the unconventional. It is not a perfect science to play with this grip, and we often arrive at less than ideal circumstances in the literature. But if you just take the time to explore other options and be open-minded, then there is a lot that this grip can offer, a lot of literature out there for you to explore. So are there any questions up to this point before I demonstrate the technique on vibraphone? Any open questions? Happy to answer anything. Yes?
Do you try to eliminate the snap from the sticks in any way?
Yes. You can wrap the mallets, and it's suggested to wrap the innermost mallet. Again, I do less on marimba, so you can firm up the grip. I personally don't like it because I feel limited in my mobility. The mallets feel a little bit stuck, but that is the biggest way. It's the same thing with any cross grip, that if you just add some sort of barrier to help eliminate that. Maybe I've gone kind of deaf to some of the clicking playing it so much, but it doesn't bother me as much. But yes, you can just wrap the innermost mallet would be the suggestion. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, I've experimented with no success. Yeah, so I'm still figuring this out as I go, and part of the reason why I don't want to, like a small reason why I didn't want to spend time talking about the inner mallet isolation is I'm not very good at it myself, but there is still, I've been able to play several pieces without that capability as a requirement. So I'm still working on it. I hope to get it. Yes, anything else? All right, well, if that is it, I will share one more piece. Oh, sorry, I have a list here. So just not an exhaustive list, but just to show you how much literature is out there. These are all marimba solos that utilize this. Lots of work by Joe Porter and Robert Patterson. Even Séjourné has written a piece. Quite a number of chamber works that are fairly important. Even in our percussion literature, we have Rain Tree, where the vibraphone part needs to utilize 3 mallets in one hand. Fabian Theory, a marimba solo that utilizes the same technique. And then there are very few vibraphone solos. I'm working on expanding that. So we have one that was written by actually our very own Louis Raymond Kolker back there, Decomposing Satie, and then Samuel Peruzlo Vallera. He has written Shunyata, which I'll speak about in a moment, and he has written for me Going to the Rising Sun for I'm Setting. So I find the grip fascinatingly capable on the vibraphone, so I spent a lot more time on that. So I'll demonstrate Shunyata by Samuel Peruzlo Vallera, and a little bit about this work is that Shunyata is a kind of state of mind or meditation found in several cultures. It's in some Indian cultures, it's in some Buddhist meditation techniques that ultimately translates to emptiness or vacuity, but not in a very kind of vapid, soulless sense. There's texts from monks describing this as if you are pulling the thread on a sweater until you arrive at its innermost pure essence. So as I play through this, and I know some of us have already heard this that are on tour with us, I hope that you find a very kind of peaceful, introspective space during this performance. So this will be Shunyata by Samuel Peruzlo Vallera. One second, I need a music stand.